Welcome and thank you all for joining us for this Alpine webinar, Standing on the Shoulders of Giants, how the 100th anniversary of the Appalachian Trail can inspire bold action today. The webinar will begin shortly. A few technical reminders before we begin. We invite you to engage with our presenters by submitting your questions in the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. Please use the chat to share useful resources or to contact us, letting us know if you are having any technical difficulties. Our speakers will be taking questions at the end of their presentations today, but feel free to share questions throughout the presentations that can be addressed at the end. With that, I will pass it over to Marianne.
Hi, everyone. And while we're waiting, I guess we could start. But if you would just put in the chat, maybe where you're from and what organization you're affiliated with, so we all get to know who's on the webinar with us, that would be great. So welcome to this webinar today. My name is Marianne Jorgensen. I am the program manager for ALPINE. It stands for Academics for Land Protection in New England, and it's a network of colleges and universities advancing land conservation in the region. We will be hearing today from Jim Levitt and Tony Hiss, who will talk about some bold ideas. A large landscape concept that's hatched by Benton MacKaye 100 years ago to create a trail from Maine to Georgia. Jim Levitt will explain how MacKaye's training at Harvard College and the Harvard Forestry School prepared him for his pioneering initiative and how it can inspire us to meet other conservation challenges of the 21st century. And then Tony Hiss will then discuss how the half-Earth idea championed by Edwin Wilson could help lead us through the current biodiversity and climate crises. The solutions, as Tony will explain, very much depend on the willing collaboration of academics with the private sector, public leaders, NGOs, and indigenous tribes. It's my pleasure to introduce our two speakers today. First, we'll hear from Jim Levitt, my colleague here at Lincoln Institute. He is the director of the International Land Conservation Network at Lincoln and the director of the Alpine Network. He also holds fellowships at the Harvard Forest and at the Highstep Foundation. And Tony Hiss is the author of 15 books, including this latest one, Rescuing the Planet, Protecting Half the Land to Heal the Earth, which he will be discussing today. Tony was a staff writer at the New Yorker for more than 30 years and a visiting scholar at New York University for 25 years. Again, please hold your questions, put them in the Q&A. We will take them at the end. And Jim, take it away.
Thank you, Marianne. I am delighted to be here with this compact but very important group to me because it includes a lot of the people who I have learned about the AT from over the last 20, 30 years. I knew of it before that, but not nearly what I've learned from all of you. So I want to give a shout out to Marianne Jorgensen and Robin for helping to organize this webinar, to Hank Foster, who many of us remember fondly as kind of a master of the AT, to David Foster at the Harvard Forest, to Dennis Schaefer, who I know who is here today and is a longtime employee of the Appalachian Trail Conservancy, to Bill Levitt, who helped to organize the Northeast Appalachian Trail Landscape Partnership, which I believe is using some grant money that Bill was able to raise to expand the footprint of the AT, to Ann Satterwaith, who has been around as a veteran of the AT, who knew many of the original players, to Charlie Chester, with whom I've worked on several articles on the AT, to Simon Rucker at the AT Land Trust, and to Sandy Mara, who's the president of the ATC. So all of you are involved in it. I see JT Horn on there, Jim Worcester, all these people who I can think of flooding into my mind who have devoted a goodly portion of their lives making this dream become a reality. And that's really what we're here to talk about today. So I am going to, if I can, share my screen. Okay. And I'm going to start from the beginning and talk about actually, I'm going to talk today about briefly about how the New England tradition of conservation innovation is expressed in part through this wonderful story about Benton MacKaye and what he has inspired us to do to this day. And I want to say that, of course, we are now in the month in which we celebrate the centennial of the publication of Benton MacKaye's brilliant idea to create something no one had ever heard before called the Appalachian Trail, which would stretch from Mount Katahdin in Maine into Georgia. And this idea over the last 100 years has become very much a reality and still has a lot of growth for in its future. And I want to say that a lot of the information that we're going to talk about today is available in greater detail in the current issue of the Appalachian Trail Journeys, or AT Journeys magazine, which is available online at journeys.appalachiantrail.org/issue/fall-2021. It's an honor to be included in that magazine, which has Benton MacKaye's original essay from 100 years ago this month in it. So this is the one that I helped to write. And then, of course, Tony Hiss wrote a book, which is an excerpt from, he wrote an article, which is an excerpt from his book, which he'll explain a little bit later. And very much has to do with how all of this leads us into the rest of the 21st century. So, so many of you have heard me talk about this before, but New England's tradition of land conservation goes back to 1634, when the early citizens of Boston voted to tax themselves to raise the money to buy open space, which has become the core of the most valuable real estate in New England and a precious public resource that many of us are able to enjoy to this day. They were followed in New England by the formation almost 200 years later of the Bunker Hill Monument Association, which was one of the first nonprofits to protect land for the public benefit, in this case, to erect a monument to the heroes of the Battle of Bunker Hill, which of course was fought on Breed's Hill, next to Bunker Hill. And I want to point out that Sarah Josepha Hale, a woman publisher in the 1840s, really raised the money that allowed them to complete this monument. And it is women as well as men who have been integral to this tradition. The Mount Auburn Cemetery in 1831 was founded both as an arboretum and a herbarium and a botanical garden, and as the final resting place of eminent New Englanders and a place to inspire their living relatives. I love the prose that Supreme Court Justice Joseph Story offered on the day that Mount Auburn was opened. He thought that cemeteries might be turned from places of gloom to places of moral uplift. Why, he asked, do we not enlist it with more persuasive energy in the cause of human improvement? Why do we not make it a more efficient instrument to elevate ambition, to stimulate genius, and to dignify learning? And I think that that is something that is very familiar to all the members of Alpine today, who are protecting land, indeed, to dignify learning, stimulate genius, elevate ambition, and try to take life as we know it into the 22nd century. The Boston Public Garden, again, a nonprofit that was built on the landfill next to the Boston Common in the 1830s, late 1830s, and was acquired by the city of Boston not until nearly 1860. The world's first regional land trust, inspired by the musings of Charles Eliot, who wrote an essay called The Waverly Oaks in Garden and Forest in March of 1890. This younger Charles Eliot was the protege of Frederick Law Olmsted and wrote, again, this is a lovely quote Purely natural scenery supplies an education in the love of beauty and a means of human enjoyment at least as valuable as that afforded by pictures and casts. As Boston's lovers of art united to found the Art Museum, so her lovers of nature should now rally to preserve for themselves and all people as many as possible of these scenes of natural beauty, which by great good fortune still exist near their doors. And I know viscerally what he's talking about, because these Waverly Oaks, the last surviving Waverly Oak, in fact, is about 3 miles from the house that I'm sitting in right now, and continues to be a place of great public recreation. The Massachusetts Audubon Society, founded by Harriet Hemingway and her cousin Minna Hall, who founded the oldest, not the first, but the oldest Audubon Society operating today in the United States. And Miss Hall, Hill, I said Hill there, but it's Minna Hall, gave us a wonderful quote in sort of her dry New England humor when she said, "We sent our circulars asking the women to join a society for the protection of birds, especially egrets. Some women joined, and others who preferred to wear feathers did not join." So Minna and her cousin, Harriet Hemingway, founded this society, which led to the establishment of the Migratory Bird Act that Teddy Roosevelt championed. So again, never question the ability of a small group of people to change the world. It's the only thing that ever has, as Margaret Mead later intoned. And then following all of these New Englanders who invented land trusts and public parks and public gardens and garden cemeteries, we have this very interesting character named Benton MacKaye, who exactly a century ago proposed in the Journal of the American Institute of Architects a trail and a buffer, a realm around it that would stretch from Maine to Georgia and be a great boon to society and to wilderness and to the ability to gather our thoughts about us as we take a long trek. And lo and behold, his invention, which didn't exist, has come to life. And there's a resource that's used by millions of people a year, either as a day hike or a through hike resource. It is a global icon. It has been replicated from the Pacific coast in the United States to the Iron Curtain in Germany, the former Iron Curtain, which is now a hiking trail, to many, many other places around the world. So he really did invent something that was novel, strategically significant, measurably effective, transferable, and enduring. The New England Forestry Foundation in 1944 was one of the very first organizations that particularly focused on sustainable forestry. The Northern Forest Alliance, created in 1990, proposed the protection of vast swaths of forest land in northern New England. And in fact, a great deal of that protection has now been achieved. Not all of it, but a great deal of it. The Pingree easement and the first phase of the Down East Lakes easement in the early 2000s that made the New England Forestry Foundation the third largest land trust in terms of acres protected in the United States, which is an amazing accomplishment for a tiny little organization that has between 6 and 20 employees at any given time to be the third largest land trust in the country. The Wildlands and Woodlands paper and organizational effort that David Foster has articulated in 2005 and again in 2010 and again in 2017, that makes as an accessible scenario and almost conventional wisdom that we can protect some 70% of New England forest land, of New England land overall as forest land during this century. And it's a goal towards which we are working right now. And finally, another famous resident of New England, Edward O. Wilson, who has championed the idea that through this century, we could protect half of the Earth's surface of land and marine resources, water, for biodiversity conservation. And the COP15 of the Convention on Biological Diversity is working in the direction of that by working to adopt a 30% by 2030 goal this month in its conferences in Kunming, China, which it will resume next year with the votes of the national groups that represent their countries in this Convention on Biological Diversity. So for one reason or another, the place which we are working, and indeed the universities in which we are working or with which we are affiliated, have really been a hotbed for innovation in conservation. They will continue, I dare say, to be so, and very critically over the next 20 to 30 years, so that we can bring climate change under control, we can protect biodiversity habitat, and we can pass this beautiful world that we are so privileged to live in on to the next generation. So with that, I want to thank you, and I want to pass it on to Tony, who has written really an entire book on the subject of the work that is ahead of us in the 21st century. Tony, can you, I'm going to stop sharing. If you would share your slides, I think we're ready to go. I also want to tell you that Tony was recently, took a fall and has a beautiful black eye, which he is recovering from, and I don't want anybody to be alarmed. He's in good condition and happy to be with us today. Tony, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Jim. Can you see my slides on the screen? That's great.
Looks great.
I did want to say that I wanted to be able to say that I was coming fresh from the conservation battlegrounds to be with you today, but in fact, I tripped getting off a train the other day and had to get a few stitches over the eye. Doing very well, thanks. And delighted to have a chance to be here with a lot of old friends and a lot of people who've been thinking so long and so hard about what's next. I came at this subject from a slightly different angle than Jim did, thinking about the biodiversity and the fact that we're now faced with the possible loss of 1 million species of plants and animals. It's perhaps not a coincidence that New England is sort of the first region that began to think so seriously about conservation, because New England was sort of the first region that took it in the eye, and it was the first region abandoned by its farmers. It was the first region that founded the factories, but then it lost its factories. So it's been playing recuperation for a long time. And one of the strengths of New England is that it attracts talent from afar. And it's probably fair to say that Ed Wilson, although he's been on a Harvard faculty for more than 60 years, actually came up from Alabama and still likes to refer to himself as a Southern boy who came north to earn a living. But he too came at this feeling, just as Benton MacKaye, I think, was affected by the diminishment of people's lives, confined as he thought they might be, but to what he called the beehive cities. Wilson, as a biologist and a scientist and a field biologist, going all over the world to study ants and other critters, when he would return to these sites, was always shocked by the loss of the abundance he was finding. So that loss is at the heart of much of what we think about. It's what the British novelist Zadie Smith has referred to as local sorrow. People looking around at their own places and circumstances and wanting to do something about the things that mean the most to them. We have been losing species. This was the last male northern white rhino, succumbed a few years ago on a morning when his keeper had come in to give him a final scratch behind the ear. We've had to coin a new phrase, unfortunate new word. An endling means the last of its species. This was the last of a subspecies of Galapagos tortoises. Lonesome George, who died at the age of 101. One reason we've had so much trouble is summed up in this picture, which was called American Progress in 1872, a picture which received wide distribution all over North America. And it shows the march of progress. That's that golden-haired young lady with not very many clothes on, floating over the landscape as she moves from east to west, bringing with her stagecoaches, railroads, telegraph wires. Retreating before her are Native Americans, buffalo, a snarling bear. We had this odd notion that we could only do one thing at a time. We could either change places or keep them the same. And if we changed them, they had to be very different from what they had been. Fortunately, someone like MacKaye came along not that long afterwards and began to think at a greater scale. The story is, of course, that the year he graduated from college in 1900, he and a friend bushwhacked up Stratton Mountain in the Green Mountains of Vermont, shinnied up the tallest trees they could find to get a better view. And swaying there, as MacKaye later said, I felt as if atop the world with a sort of planetary feeling. I seemed to perceive peaks far southward, hidden by old Earth's curvature. Would a footpath someday reach them from where I was perched? That was the beginning of his thinking. He shared it with a few people in the next few years. His camp counselor said, "A damn fool scheme, Mac." But when it was published in the Journal of the American Institute of Architects, as Jim has said, in 1921, it galvanized an extraordinary group of people, of volunteers for the most part, who began hacking a trail through a footpath through the wilderness, through them across down the mountain peaks. And within the next 16 years, that path had come into being. One of the phrases MacKaye liked to say is optimism is oxygen. It's certainly, he breathed a lot of oxygen into the hiking community. Another one of his phrases was, speak softly, but carry a big map. For MacKaye, the human biped, as he said, comes first. He was not so much a conservationist in terms of protecting plants and animals, but he wanted that realm, as he called it, beyond the mountains, beyond the peaks of the mountains, to be protected for the benefit of humanity. I like to say that Macayan math is 1 + 1 + 1 = 4. He thought if people could have a connection to primeval landscapes, to farmed landscapes, and to cities and towns, all three, then something else would come into being, what he called the gradually awakening human mind. As we all know, it takes a long time to get something like this accomplished. And it's really only now that the wonderful people at the Appalachian Trail Conservancy have been able to start thinking beyond protecting the footpath to protecting the larger landscape. And they're now thinking in terms of not so much a realm as a climate corridor, an enormous landscape that can be of benefit to plants and animals moving north in the face of climate change, and also places where they can hold fast, resilient landscapes where we can retard the process of climate change because there's local variation that allows them to move within their range rather than having to take off and scamper northward. The Macayan landscape, seen here in this wonderful map that I had made for my book, is really only the smallest of the great landscapes of North America. We're very lucky on this continent to have a geography that organizes our thinking. Mackay's Appalachian Mountains of the east are paralleled by the Rockies in the west, and a Canadian lawyer and activist and conservation activist Harvey Locke had a similar vision for that landscape back in the 1990s when he was camping one night and thought there's a continuity of landscape from Yellowstone Park all the way up to the north of the end of the Yukon, Yellowstone to Yukon as he called it, and that began the initiative, the Y2Y, Yellowstone to Yukon initiative, which so far has protected 22% of that landscape. Then across the top, we have the incredible boreal forest, hard for a city kid like me even to wrap his mind around. It's something like 3,500 miles long. It's hundreds of miles in the other direction from north to south. And it's probably the most intact and largest wildness left on the planet. Then down at the bottom, we've got the recently designated North American Coastal Plain Biodiversity Hotspot. We're wrapped in all this incredibleness. People like Ed Wilson have been working on the half-Earth, the science part of it, and have come up with the idea that most plants and animals need something like half of their original habitat in order to survive. It's a variation, a range from going from maybe 25% in some places, in some circumstances, to 75 in others, but half is a good mean for it, supplemented by the biological math that Ed Wilson was able to put together with his colleague MacArthur and others, saying that if we stay at about 15%, we're up to maybe 17% now, of protecting land. In the long run, we can only hang on to about 25% of the species with which we share the world. However, bumping that up to 50% means we can save 85 to 90%, not everything, but close to everything. Please take one moment to look into the steely gaze of a man who was by no means a New Englander. This is Vladimir Ivanovich Veranovsky, a Russian biologist who is a hero in that country. There's a metro station in Moscow named for him. There's a crater on the dark side of the moon named for him. Still relatively unknown over here. He wrote the first sort of biography of the biosphere in 1925. And he was one of the first people to point out that the biosphere, this living band of life around the planet, is huge, absolutely enormous when you look at it from side to side, which is the way we normally do down here. But it also has this third dimension, or this almost absence of third dimension from top to bottom. Almost all life that we know of is confined to a band between the bottom of the ocean and the top of Mount Everest. That's a distance of, say, 12.5 miles, kind of distance that in a decent car you could drive down if it were flat in 20 minutes or so. So we're constrained by this double legacy of the biosphere. Its enormity, its abundance, and at the same time, its vulnerability and its innate thinness. All of us are under these circumstances. And it's the kind of thing that astronauts looking back at the Earth strikes them. It's called the overview effect. They see the gorgeousness, but also the vulnerability of the planet. The person most recently affected by that was Bill Shatner, Captain Kirk of the Star Trek, who was given a lift by the Bezos people up into the space for 10 minutes, and even in 10 minutes was enough to make him say that this was such a profound experience, he hoped he would never lose it for the rest of his life. So certain principles seem to derive from half Earth. Could be called the 3 R's: retain what's still wild, restore what was once wilder, reconnect the areas of importance. The boreal landscape is the place that we have the best chances with on this continent, because despite being maltreated by Europeans, the indigenous people of the North, the First Nations, never were dispossessed from their land, and now are being turned to by the Canadian government to set up a whole new parallel network of national parks that they will run to protect millions and millions and millions of acres of the boreal forest. We also have a second tradition of national parks. We invented national parks, which is the Green Line Park Initiative, begun in the Adirondacks up in the 1890s. The idea that we could have special places, special natural places that are not necessarily all in public ownership. Adirondack Park is about half and half private and half public, but the idea is it will not change except in ways that preserve that specialness. In the 1970s, the National Park Service thought maybe it was time to revive this idea and set up a whole network of US Green Line parks. And they produced a preliminary map of these treasures, the treasure map, which I had digitized for my book. And it was going to be the great environmental initiative and legacy of the second Jimmy Carter administration. Well, of course, there never was a second Jimmy Carter administration. He got whomped by Ronald Reagan. So it went on the back burner again. But now suddenly 30 by 30 is not just a talking point. It's been adopted by the International Union for the Conservation of Nature as a stepping stone towards 50 by 50. It's about to be endorsed by the countries of the world in the Kunming meeting in China, which began earlier this month and will continue next spring. And it brings us to yet another situation, which is to think about the 70% and how to make sure that the 70% in its own way supports the 30% that can get more stringent protection. Of course, in New England, as I know, thanks to wildlands and woodlands, you have a much more ambitious goal, and that is to protect 70% of the landscape, of the forested and farm landscape of your amazing area. So all of a sudden, we can begin to think about exporting the Canadian and Australian model of turning vast amounts of land over to the indigenous populations who know how to take care of them better than anyone else, because they've already been doing it for tens of thousands of years. And one obvious place to expand that would be in the so-called Andes, Amazon, Atlantic corridor of South America, where, as you can see, in green are protected areas and in yellow are indigenous areas, which could be amalgamated. And it's something that we in North America can feel connected to, because the chain of mountains that starts with our Rockies runs down directly through the Andes too. So we're linked already. The Green Line Park movement is beginning to arouse itself from slumber too. The Delmarva Peninsula on the eastern shore of the Chesapeake Bay, strangely carved up by colonial politics into 3 states, Delaware, Maryland, Virginia, hence Delmarva. Leaders from all 3 of those states have now banded together to decide that they collectively will protect 50% of that peninsula by the year 2030. And they've set up a Delmarva Oasis steering committee. I'm honored by the fact that they asked me to be a member of that committee. And we're in a messy situation, a wonderfully messy situation. Maybe it's half Earth 2.0. The Chesapeake Bay is the largest and most productive estuary in North America. But we now know that in order to protect its health, we have to think about the health of a much larger landscape, the Chesapeake Bay Watershed, which is almost as big as New England. And to keep the watershed healthy, we have to think about the Chesapeake Bay airshed, which is even bigger, maybe the size of Alaska, stretching all the way up to places like Toronto. And it isn't so easy just to think immediately about the Chesapeake Bay, the sprawling Chesapeake Bay watershed, because part of it is on the far side of the Appalachian Mountains. It stretches all the way up to Cooperstown in New York, home of the Baseball Hall of Fame. And people up there don't think about blue crabs as of anything of importance, but you do think about brook trout as something of importance. So we have to begin to think about bifocal vision. If I'm saving my beloved brook trout, in a funny way, that's also helping save someone else's beloved blue crabs. People like Benton MacKaye and Ed Wilson have remarkable convening abilities. People like Jim Levitt have remarkable convening abilities. And to bring together people with different ways of thinking, one of the toughest ones is one that goes back to the beginning of humanity. People who arrive in this world and think of it as here for the taking, and people who arrive in this world and think of it as a place that needs to be taken care of. Within the context of the thinness that Veranovsky was the first to point out to us, perhaps everyone is one way or another afflicted by the local sadness, what Zadie Smith called the local sadness. And that's a way of finding a way to speak to people who otherwise think of themselves as diametrically opposed. I like to think that the first delegation to the Kunming conference began to get there way in advance of the conference itself. Last year, no one quite knows why, something like 14 or 15 elephants left their sanctuary in southernmost China down near the Laotian border and began to wander through the countryside, eventually reaching Kunming itself 300 miles to the north, where finally they were enticed to turn around by having the roads to the south closed and watered down so that they were colder and spread with delicious food. I like to think of them as the first delegation representing the other species arriving in Kunming, because the elephant in the room is us kicking out the elephants in the room. Whatever catches your fancy, that's your way into protecting biodiversity, protecting the world against climate change. Among birders, there's this phrase, the spark bird, the species that at one point in their life called out to them and wouldn't let go and changed them for the rest of their life. But it doesn't have to be a bird. It could be swinging from a tree on the top of a mountain like Benton MacKaye. It could be a gorgeous view, a gorgeous landscape, or something that seems to be disappearing and needs to be taken care of. Thanks very much. If anyone wants to purchase my book, and I hope some will, I'll be delighted to send them a social distancing special, an inscribed bookplate. And now I don't have to share my screen anymore, and Jim and I can have a conversation and answer some questions.
Thank you, Tony. You are my definition of indefatigable. You bounce off of trading platforms and are back in shape on the internet in no time. That was, as usual, very eloquent. And I can tell everybody that Tony writes beautifully. So if you get a chance to take a look at his book and get that autograph, I encourage you to do so. We have, I believe, in the Q&A, no open questions. We have in the chat a lot of self-identifiers, but I don't think we have any inquiries right away. So I'm going to give people a chance to go to their websites. I don't know what I just did. Hold on, Tony. Go to their websites, offer some questions in the Q&A section, and ask Tony, and I will respond to this as well. What have you seen in the last week or two that gives you a spark of hope, that encourages you that in the midst of 6 years of dreary news, we're going to find our way out of this? Anything in particular that strikes you?
Well, something you referenced in your last slide, Jim, the new Billionaires for Biodiversity movement. Suddenly, some of the great philanthropists have decided that this is their new cause. The first one was Hans-Jörg Wyss, an indefatigable Swiss American industrialist, who several years ago said he was going to spend $1 billion on biodiversity. But now he's been joined by Jeff Bezos and others. And not to be outdone, this has put up another $500 million. This is a very encouraging movement, and it's something that can help fund the new indigenous protected areas movement. In Canada, they like to say that they make good rangers because they're the mucklucks on the ground. That's a very encouraging movement. The fact that the world is suddenly no longer treating the idea of 30 by 30 as something bizarre and outlandish, literally outlandish, or as a BHAG, big, hairy, audacious goal, but as a practical and not easily obtained, but practical objective. The Biden administration has signed on to the same 30 by 30 goal in a non-threatening way, saying that this will only happen if we can work with cooperating people who buy into this vision. Again, another reason why convening is I think the most important factor in 21st century conservation, and finding common ground so that we can work as a team.
Great. That's a great answer. I will add to that, and then we've got 2 questions and more coming on the screen. I will add to that I have had the chance to work with the Australian Land Conservation Alliance, which is the Australian equivalent of the Land Trust Alliance in the US, and am watching developments in Australia very closely, if only because Australia is the place that brought us Rupert Murdoch and his particular brand of using the press. And what's happening in Australia is that even though there's a government which is clinging to coal and gas as tightly as they can, the entrepreneurs and the local communities in that country are are very rapidly adopting both renewable energy technologies on scales that nobody ever imagined before. That is, they're now designing a project which will take gigawatts of electricity harvested from solar collectors and wind turbines in northwest Australia in a cable all the way to Singapore. It's something of a scale that I think only Benton MacKaye might have imagined before. And at the same time in Australia, the Aboriginal community is taking a lead in protecting really the core of Australia as open space that can be returned to a somewhat more natural state. And we're talking about vast quantities of land. And the conclusion by a lot of people that we might just get to 30 by 30 if we are thoughtful about engaging our indigenous friends in taking responsibility and accepting responsibility if those of us on the other side of the table choose to give it, for the stewardship of vast quantities of land. So everything I read says that 30 by 30 is not an impossible goal. It's ambitious. We might not get all the way there by 2030, but I think it's doable and conceivable. And once you have a scenario that's conceivable, that's a huge part of the battle. So with that, Tony, I want to ask you a question from Kathy Thatcher, who says, could you please speak to the concept of pro-forestation? I would also like to hear your thoughts on William Moomaw and Suzanne Simard's position on the protection of our forests. So why don't you start with pro-forestation and then move on to Moomaw and Simard.
Pro-forestation, I'm glad you raised that. I should have mentioned it earlier. This is, there's a lot of talk now about reforestation, because we know that trees have within them carbon that, if they are chopped down, is released into the atmosphere and adds to warming. Pro-forestation is the realization that mature forests, or at least semi-mature forests, actually are growing at a faster rate and incorporating more carbon than the saplings we plant from scratch and reforestation. And places like New England, Pennsylvania, places that were cut over in the late 19th century, both for timber and to fuel steel mills, and then abandoned and then rescued by the early 20th century foresters like Gifford Pinchot, are now 100 years or so old. They are these forests that are most rapidly incorporating more carbon as they grow and grow. So thanks to the fact that we began to tidy up after our swaths of deforestation in the late 19th century, we're gifted with the very carbon producers and carbon holders onto that we need. So it's a relatively simple matter now to start to survey where these reforests are and make sure that we start to hang on to them in terms of contributing to a nature-based solution to climate change.
Do you want me to take Moomaw and Simard
Sure.
swing at it? I am not current with the latest collaboration of Bill Moomaw and Suzanne Simard, so I'm not able to answer that. I've always admired and liked Bill Moomaw a lot. I agree, however, with the David Fosters of the world that we have to do conservation on working woodlands as well as on wildlands, and that keeping that balance is a healthy idea. I will simply say that. I had a chance to read Suzanne Simard's book this summer, and I can only say that she is an inspiring scientist, and that the discoveries she'd made about the way that mycorrhizal, if I'm pronouncing it correctly, networks help to connect forests into living communities that pass information and nutrients and no end of things among one another to keep the whole community vibrant, is just a stunning and inspiring piece of science. And I think it's got to be part of the core of the sort of thought process that we have as we go forward in trying to protect a large part of the Earth's surface. So I hope Suzanne Simard gets a big international scientific award, and I won't name any in particular, but she has done a brilliant job at bringing those ideas to life and making us understand that under our very feet are networks that are connecting life on Earth.
That's what I would say too, Jim, that she is extending human awareness below ground by pointing out the awareness and the connectivity between the trees in a forest, and that we have to begin to think about a grove as a place rather than a tree as a separate place. There's more community there. So that's so helpful because we know that soils are going to be part of maintaining biodiversity as well. So, and she too is a brilliant, forceful person. So I agree with you. It's a brilliant book and couldn't be more timely.
Agreed. All right, now Wes Ward, as is his habit and his skill, asks a question that's just a little bit provocative, but I think well placed. He says, MacKaye's conception of New England levees to turn back Boston's metro expansion always puts me off. What have I missed in this concept? Are these Green Line parks the resurrection of the levee concept at a much larger scale? And I would tack onto that question, or are we morphing that idea into something new for the 21st century? So Tony, why don't you take the first swing at that, and then I will follow up.
I don't think of the idea of trying to direct the flow of growth as a negative. On the eastern shore of Maryland, for instance, by keeping half the land open, it's an area that historically escaped suburbanization because it was always 15 minutes too far away for people who needed to commute into cities to work. If a Green Line park is impeding people, then it's not a helpful innovation. If it's there to help organize communities and help them grow in a way that so that everyone in that community retains a sense of the specialness of that community, then I think they have a great place. And in this case, it's something that's grown from below. It's self-organized. It's not something imposed by any government group, which means that it's more inclusive. And boy, does the Eastern Shore need inclusivity. This was part of a free state that was a slave-holding state. There is still many issues of diversity that need to be adjusted down there. The home of Harriet Tubman, the home of so many great
Frederick Douglass.
Yes, yes. Thank you for the question, because we always have to make sure we're not imposing new restrictions on people.
I would just add to that MacKaye stood on the shoulders, as I wrote in the article that I offered to the ATC, of giants that came before him, of John Wesley Powell, of Gifford Pinchot, of Nathaniel Shaler. But he didn't stop with their ideas. He came up and reconnected and brought his own creativity to the table and conceived of this Appalachian Trail, which was unlike anything that had been imagined before, at least in the United States. And I think it's incumbent on us to stand on his shoulders and all the other people who created the Wilderness Act and the ATC and see what we need to do right now in this century. And I think that Wes asked, is MacKaye rolling with the idea of the AT as a climate corridor? I have no idea what Benton MacKaye is doing right now or where he's doing it, but it's appropriate for us to consider what's going on right now as a climate corridor very seriously, and to take the work of new Benton MacKaye's, new creative people. I think of Mark Anderson at the Nature Conservancy, and say, let's understand how they're reconnecting these ideas to give us hope for the future. And I think that the corridor idea, the AT, turns out to be one of the best biodiversity corridors in Eastern North America. Abby Weinberg is at the Open Space Institute, is very articulate on this subject. And so I think that the AT has its original purpose. It has new purposes. It probably will have even more purposes as we go into the future. But let's not stop with MacKaye. Let's start with MacKaye and go from there. And yes, Wes, he is buried in Shirley, Massachusetts. I just looked that up on the web. I don't know if it's the church cemetery. I've been there. It's a cemetery that's near several churches and town halls in the historic center of Shirley, Massachusetts. So I will ask one more question, and then I think it's time for us to adjourn this session. Ralph Baker asked the questions: do we have any thoughts on the International Appalachian Trail? He once met a thru hiker who introduced me to that concept and said he'd walked it twice. So presumably he's walked from the Chesapeake Bay Peninsula at least as far as Georgia. Tony, do you want to add anything to that international concept?
Yes, I think that this is a natural extension. And I remember reading about the guy it occurred to him, the first person that occurred to him for the International AT, said he got so excited, he pulled off the road into a gas station and began telling the guy pumping the gas all about this amazing vision he'd had, completely stumping the guy he was talking to. Because it is a natural continuation. I would say that I think in terms of the climate corridor, I think the AT Landscape Partnership and people like Dennis Schaefer are so sensitive to the fact that people come at this with such different perspectives. It's not just that people in the eastern cities have often been disdainful of the people in the cities on the other side of the Appalachians, the Midwestern cities, but both have often been disdainful over the years of the people living in the mountains, and seeing them as a kind of leftover population that no longer has importance. Well, we're all tremendously affected by where we are, and we've all got to find ways of pulling together and seeing where our values overlap with the values of the next person. So I think that that's one of the exciting parts about talking about a new metaphor of a climate corridor, is a way of extending the conversation to include yet another range of groups that hadn't been on board before.
So I will simply add to that one might have thought, if they were presented with the reality of the COVID-19 crisis, that it would have thrown sand into the gears of the conservation movement, and that without a way to gather together in big conferences, we would just lose enthusiasm and momentum. But I think that the tools that have emerged, including the one we're using right now on Zoom, have allowed us to continue to convene in small groups and very large groups and continue to push the work forward that needs to be pushed forward. And so I encourage you all to take heart. I thank you all for coming today. Tony, I thank you for your contribution of your book and your time and your energy and your creativity. And with that, I want to adjourn this meeting, Mary Ann, and say thanks so much for pulling us together. And I'll give you, Mary Ann, the final word.
No final word, Tony. Thanks for being here. We appreciate your attendance, and I want to thank both of you for the very important talk and ideas to think about. Thank you.
All right. Good afternoon to you all. Tony, you want a last word?
Just want to say thanks to everyone, and I want to be as helpful as I can to anyone, whatever project I find MacKaye's light shining through so many projects. We're lucky to be around just at a time when there's still a chance to do so much and of such importance. And thank you, Jim, for what you do. Mary Ann, just telling me she's working with colleges now to even begin to think about putting parts of their campuses aside as protected areas. A revolutionary thought, and there's so much to be done, and it's just great that we're all engaged in it.
All right, well, happy birthday to the Appalachian Trail idea, which is 100 years old this month, and we will see you all again soon in the next Alpine webinar. Good afternoon.
Thank you.